I'm going to show you a little piece of tape that I find funny. It's not funny, but I will admit that I find it funny. On March 31st, they did that thing in the Oval Office that they've gotten pretty good at now. They had the executive orders in their big leather folders like menus. They had them laid out. The president had his presidential ceremonial pens, the ones that the president sometimes has trouble with the caps on. They had them laid out. They had the relevant stakeholders and public officials standing by. They had a little podium set up where the president could make remarks ahead of time. When they do executive orders, you don't have to do them in this ornate, staged way, but they do. And they do it in this staged way because they want reporters and photographers to be there to witness these signings. And the problem with that system is that sometimes those reporters ask questions, even when you don't want them to. And there is now, I think we now have good evidence. There's one category of question that basically works like freeze tag on this president. You ask him about this one thing, tag, and he freezes. He forgets what he's doing. And in this case, the whole point of the photo op just falls apart. He just left the room.
Thank you very much.
Mr. President, today with your tweet, were you trying to tell the Justice Department to grant immunity to Michael Flynn? Were you trying to do that, Mr. President? Was that your intention, Mr. President, sir?
Thank you, President.
Mr. President, was that your intention, Mr. President? Was that your intention, sir?
Okay. Thanks, sir.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys.
So he didn't sign them?
He did not sign them.
He did not sign them.
The little menus with the executive orders still sitting there on the desk. Mike Pence is like, he has to go get them, follow the president out. We're really not going to sign these, sir? No, we'll just do it. That happened March 31st, right after Mike Flynn asked for immunity in exchange for his testimony in the Trump-Russia affair. The president was doing a photo op to sign 2 executive orders in front of reporters with those stakeholders standing nearby while he did the signing. But he got asked about Mike Flynn, and that apparently was it. Okay, forget it. No signing. This thing is over. And so Mike Pence has to go back and get the executive orders off the desk, and he really does bring them to that other room where presumably the president signed them later. I checked on the White House website today. They do say he signed those eventually, just not when he was supposed to. That was March 31st. Today, that same game of freeze tag got played again in the Oval Office, again at a signing ceremony with the executive orders and the little menus and everything. At least this time, though, he had already signed the things in the menus before somebody said the magic words that froze him like a stone.
Any regrets about Michael Flynn?
Thank you very much.
If you want to turn this president to stone, ask him about Mike Flynn. And this particular game of freeze tag does not just afflict the president. It is also, in a sort of different way, but I think it's the same affliction for this congressman, Republican chairman of the House Intel Committee, Congressman Devin Nunes. As chair of the Intelligence Committee investigating the Russian attack on the U.S. election last year and whether the Trump campaign was involved in it, the Intelligence Committee under Devin Nunes held one blockbuster public hearing. And after that first blockbuster public hearing, they had a second one scheduled for the following week. Their second public hearing was due to include public testimony from Sally Yates, from the woman who had been the acting attorney general in the first days of the Trump administration, before Trump fired her for refusing to defend his Muslim ban in the courts. But Sally Yates was not due to testify before the Intelligence Committee about getting fired, about the Muslim ban. She was due to testify about Michael Flynn. Everybody turned to stone. There was very intense interest about what Sally Yates would say about Mike Flynn, because she appears to have had a key role in the process that eventually led to him being fired as national security advisor. But the sequence of events that led up to that firing, particularly with regard to Sally Yates's involvement in it, that sequence of events really is insane and still totally unexplained. And she is one of the only people who might be able to shed some light on it, other than the top people at the White House, who so far aren't talking about it. I mean, just think about how that stacked up. In the transition, right after the election, but before the inauguration, we now know that Mike Flynn had fairly extensive discussions with Russian officials, including repeated discussions with them about U.S. sanctions on Russia. Russia obviously wants sanctions against them lifted. Some of the sanctions that are on them because of their attack on our election. So this is a very sensitive thing for Mike Flynn to be talking to them about. But we know he had those conversations during the transition. That said, he denied that he was having those conversations at that time. And the White House was denying it on his behalf as well.
What I can confirm, having spoken to him about it, is that those conversations that happened to occur around the time that the United States took action to expel diplomats had nothing whatsoever to do with those sanctions.
But that still leaves open the possibility that there might have been other conversations about the sanctions.
Yeah, I don't believe there were more conversations,
okay. Let's move on.
But I can confirm that those elements were not part of that discussion.
So there's been one call. I talked to General Flynn about this again last night. One call talks about 4 subjects. One was the loss of life that occurred in the plane crash that took their military choir. 2 was Christmas and holiday greetings. 3 was to facilitate or to talk about a conference in Syria on ISIS, and 4 was to set up to talk about, after the inauguration, setting up a call between President Putin and President Trump.
Any other conversations between General Flynn and Russian members of the government?
Not that I'm aware of.
It's White House spokesman. That was January 23rd. It's his first briefing, 2 days after the swearing in. Right? He's saying, we've talked to Flynn about this. Definitely no sanctions talk. I've talked to General Flynn about this. He told me what he talked to them about. He was not talking to them about sanctions. He has explained to us exactly what all his conversations were with the Russians about. Definitely nothing about sanctions. That was the 23rd. The next day, the 24th, we now know General Flynn was interviewed by the FBI on this matter. He reportedly told the FBI what had by now become the administration's public line on this subject. Nope, definitely no discussions with the Russians about sanctions. Didn't talk to them about that at all. That conversation between Flynn and FBI agents happened on January 24th. Incidentally, I should mention it is a crime to lie to the FBI. If General Flynn, in fact, denied that he'd had any conversations with Russian officials about sanctions, when he had, in fact, had those conversations, well, that would be a big deal. And if he did tell them that he didn't talk to the FBI, that he didn't talk to the Russians about sanctions, we also now know that if he tried to sell that to the FBI would have known at that time that that was not true. Because we now know that General Flynn's actual conversations with the Russians were subject to FBI surveillance. So they know what he was talking to them about. And 2 days after he had his interview with the FBI, where he reportedly lied to them about his contacts with the Russians and what he was saying to the Russians, 2 days after that, this remarkable decision was made, the apex of the drama scene in the movie, where the acting attorney general, Sally Yates, faced with this information about the national security advisor and what he's saying and what she knows has actually happened thanks to that FBI surveillance, she makes this remarkable decision to go directly to the White House to warn them about their national security advisor. Quoting from the Washington Post bombshell on this, quote, the acting attorney general warned the Trump White House that the national security advisor was potentially vulnerable to Russian blackmail because he had been lying about his contacts with the Russian government. And the Justice Department and the FBI knew about it. They had proof. So she brings that bombshell to the White House. This is like flashing red light, bells and whistles, danger, Will Robinson, right? The national security advisor to the president might be getting blackmailed by the Russians because he's having contacts with the Russians that he is lying about. Has anything like that ever happened before in the history of the American presidency? Not that we know of. Huge deal. How does the White House respond? They do not respond. At least as far as we can tell, no visible response. I mean, that flashing red warning comes from the Department of Justice 6 days after the inauguration, January 26th. There is no visible response at all on the 26th or the 27th. On the 28th, we see Flynn in the Oval Office. That's him sitting in on that disastrous call where Donald Trump yelled at and hung up on the Prime Minister of Australia. Another time that day, there he was staring at the back of Donald Trump's head while Donald Trump held another one of his signing statement photo ops where he holds up the little menu for everybody to see. This was before the mere mention of Michael Flynn's name at an event like this could bring one of those things to a screeching halt. 3 days after that, Flynn's still there, right next to Jared, at the meeting of the cybersecurity experts in the White House. Roll into February, Flynn is still there in the White House briefing room, putting Iran on notice. Remember that? What did that mean anyway? And then days go by, no response. And there's Mike Flynn at the National Prayer Breakfast. Meanwhile, they fire Sally Yates. They fire the woman who had come up from the Justice Department to the White House to warn them directly about their national security advisor and him lying about his ties to a foreign government and the prospect that the Russians might be blackmailing him. They fire her. They keep Flynn. They keep him on and on and on and on and on. Meanwhile, luckily, journalism continues on this subject. On the 8th of February, which is a couple weeks after Sally Yates had issued her warning to the White House, the Washington Post asks Flynn directly if he had discussed sanctions with the Russian government. Quote, asked in an interview whether he had ever done so, he twice said no. That's the 8th of February. Then the next day, the 9th of February, Flynn's spokesman issues a news statement saying, when Flynn said no yesterday, what he actually meant was more like he can't remember. Might have done, might not have done. By February 10th, that story blowing up in the Washington Post is getting to be not only serious about Flynn, but it's starting to get seriously weird that the White House hasn't commented on it.
Mr. President, what do you make of reports that General Flynn had conversations with the Russians about sanctions before you were sworn in?
I don't know about it. I haven't seen it. What report is that? I haven't seen it.
Reporting that he talked to the ambassador to Russia before you were inaugurated about sanctions, maybe trying to...
I haven't seen that. I'll look at that.
I haven't seen that. The president says, I haven't seen that, I haven't heard anything about that. What is it, Flynn? He had contacts with the Russians about sanctions? Really? Says he's never heard of this before. He'll look into it. That was February 10th. The president had been informed about this on January 26th. The White House had known about this since a few days after the inauguration. And the acting attorney general had come to the White House and told them about this. And there's Trump, more than 2 weeks later, professing total ignorance. What's this? I haven't heard about this. 3 days after that, the Washington Post is finally able to report the apex drama of this, the trip from Sally Yates to the Justice Department back up to the White House with that blistering warning. They're finally able to report that that meeting happened. The whole thing gets so bizarre, it can't possibly stand, and ultimately, Michael Flynn resigns. So, whatever you think about Michael Flynn, the behavior of the White House here is very strange, right? The vice president lied on TV. The White House spokesman lied in the briefing room, all according to them because of untrue information that was conveyed to them personally by Mike Flynn. The nature of those lies was such that the acting attorney general thought the national security advisor might be susceptible to Russian blackmail, which is not the kind of thing you let ride while that person is actively serving as national security advisor. Informed of that, though, the White House just sat on it for a few weeks. So you can imagine the questions, right? Sally Yates, Ms. Yates, thank you for being here. Do we have this story right? Is that really what happened? What can you tell us about what you conveyed to the White House and how they responded? So the House Intelligence Committee gets into that, right? They have this hearing, they have this blockbuster hearing where James Comey of the FBI admits that, yes, there was an ongoing counterintelligence investigation into the president's campaign as to whether or not it cooperated in the Russian attack on the United States last year. After that bombshell, we are next going to hear from Yates. The next hearing in a few days is going to be the one that has Sally Yates at it. And she's not going to be there talking about why she got fired. She's not going to be talking about the Muslim ban or the Department of Justice broadly. She is going to be talking about Michael Flynn. And so now, freeze tag, now it is Devin Nunes' time to become a pillar of salt. The day after the Comey hearing, with the Sally Yates hearing scheduled to come up next, Devin Nunes apparently decides to pull the ripcord. Eject. I got to get out of this thing. Famously now, he pulls this stunt where he goes to the White House. He meets with one of his own former staffers who's working there now, as well as a Mike Flynn protege. who the White House insisted on keeping at the National Security Council even when the new National Security Advisor wanted to fire him. He meets with those guys. They provide him with something, documents, maybe, it was never totally clear, that gamely try to create some other unrelated scandal that is definitely not Mike Flynn. And what was clear to everybody at the time was that Devin Nunes was behaving strangely, that he was explaining things in a way that didn't make sense, that he was clearly trying to create a smokescreen. It was cartoonishly obvious that that's what he was trying to do. But two material things came out of that adventure. First of all, inexplicably, despite the fact that it had no ostensible connection to that stunt at all, the first thing that happened thereafter is that the Sally Yates hearing got canceled. Oh, good. That was weeks ago now. Sally Yates hearing canceled. House Intelligence Committee says now they would still like to talk to her, but they have not rescheduled the Sally Yates appearance to talk about Mike Flynn. The other material consequence of that Devin Nunes stunt is that Devin Nunes got himself kicked off that investigation. He didn't lose his chairmanship, but he's been kicked off anything related to Russia. When they finally do that Sally Yates hearing, if they ever do it, Devin Nunes will not be in the room when she explains what she knows about Mike Flynn and how the White House responded when she told them the current sitting National Security Advisor is susceptible to blackmail by the Russians and lying about his contacts with them. I mean, who would want to be the, Trump Transition Committee member, Republican chairman of a oversight committee when the details of the Mike Flynn and the White House story come out? Would you like to be overseeing the committee at that time? So the name Mike Flynn has this remarkable effect on people. You want to see the president freeze to the point that he forgets what he's doing? Ask him a pointed question about Mike Flynn. You want to see the House Intelligence Chairman, Devin Nunes, freak out and get himself taken off the board in terms of this particular game? Well, get him closer to the real story about Mike Flynn. But that Intelligence Committee investigation is not the only board on which that game is being played, and that story is next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.